Hey everyone, we're going to get started again.
We just enjoyed your work,
Okay, so a word of explanation. The way the schedule works, it kind of looks like this is two independent things. This is actually a long panel that when the coffee magically appears, we will just find a natural stopping point and you can all rush over and get coffee and brownies and cookies and things. Or, you know, any combination. So this panel, the idea here, happily follows on actually the main threads of what's come up in both the keynotes and other questions and things recently, which is the idea of thinking about diversity and inclusion as not only a holistic, central to everything way of looking at information, but also a natural process of what we do from the beginning of starting an MLS program as a student to becoming a really engaged professional. And so you'll be hearing from a range of teachers and library directors and people doing community programs, and the idea is to show that natural inclusiveness of information, it can be achieved by putting it into everything you're doing. And it's also partly a reflection on, at least to some extent, what we haven't done collectively as a field. There's a certain irony that trying to have this big discussion with folks who chose to come to a diversity symposium, I mean, there's a certain limitation on reaching people who aren't already thinking in these terms, but hopefully we'll at least facilitate the discussion on this. So after each of us has had a chance to share some thoughts with you, we're going to have a chunk of time for a discussion, which will be amongst ourselves, but also hopefully you guys too. So I have a few slides to start with to set up the panel, and this falls under the category of things you're probably all thinking anyway, but at least let's make sure we're all. So, information raises a lot of issues in terms of inclusion. And if you look at it from the information side, you have issues of access being different among different populations for different reasons. Different information needs, behavior, availability. Even the most basic is the infrastructure where you live. Can you afford the infrastructure? These are parts of information and inclusion. The quality of access, the literacies, education, information and inclusion, it's central to so many central things that we do, whether or not we think of them as diversity issues. And diversity isn't a block. It isn't a chunk of unified, everyone's the same in it. Not only are there all these different demographics, there are all these different impacts. So you may find yourself unserved in terms of some important information or some important technology. You may find yourself underserved. It may have been designed without even thinking about you. Jonathan Lazar's talk earlier, that points to things where there's a lot of things built that no one ever thinks, oh, how do we make this accessible? And so when you're thinking of diversity in information, it's a really big tent. It's this goes to a lot of what Denise was talking about. It's race, gender, ethnicity can all be issues, but so can age, ability, literacy, geography, socioeconomic status, national origin, orientation. There are all these issues, all these traits, all these natural human conditions where information can be an issue of diversity. And this is far bigger than we've thought about historically in our field. Not like individually, but collectively. What if you would think of what diversity has been focused on in our field, it has been a lot more narrow than this big idea. And a few bits of information to contextualize what we're working with in at least the educational context. A book that came out 3 or 4 years ago did a lot of surveys of current students, current administration, the overwhelming majority of MLS students feel that they've never had a chance to take a course related to diversity. Obviously, if it was embedded in everything across the curriculum, then they'd have no way to feel like they didn't, but if it is sectioned off as a diversity course and nothing else, a lot of places don't even have the diversity course. And a study that Megha Subramaniam and I did not long after that book came out, a lot of those places that do have a diversity course on the books, it's an elective. And if you look at the chart of when it was last offered or how often, it's often an elective on the books that isn't taught with any consistency or ever. That's not good. And we also have this issue in our field, if you look back at the major diversity initiatives, most of them, not all, there's some really incredible programs that have been tried at some schools that have succeeded at some schools. There's been a lot of really good initiatives in individual places. But if you look at the overall weight that our field puts on diversity, the initiatives have primarily focused on recruiting. Now, recruiting is essential, but if you then have the exact same curriculum, and the same workplace, and the same outreach, anybody see why that might not work? So we need to, as a field, we need to start building up this discourse and thinking in larger terms. This, building it into all the courses, how do we engage all these issues that are there, that are a real part of practice, that become bigger and bigger as the nation's demographics change. And this says, approaches to teaching diversity. This can also be approaches to serving diversity, approaches to researching diversity, and this is not exhaustive. But there are so many different access points. If you want to get your curriculum, your library, or whatever, to start thinking more about diversity, start doing more, there are an amazing array of really useful ways into it in thinking about how do we deal with inclusion in information. You can think about it in terms of the populations. You can think about it in terms of the social structures of society, social justice. What is there to ensure there's equity? Well, there's a lot of equity issues with information. And libraries are one of the key social institutions. Human rights. The Declaration of Human Rights is 70 years old almost. When it was written, we didn't have the same world of information and technology, but you look back on it now, there may only be one article that's specifically about information, but try pulling off any of the other articles without it. I teach a human rights course every fall, Information and Human Rights, and the first day, first class meeting, there's an activity of, okay, everyone look up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and find all the parts that you can do successfully that don't deal with information, don't need information, aren't about information. Yeah, it's not a long list. Educational equity. Well, probably there'll be some information and technology literacy issues in there, and on and on and on. Literacy is another one. Thinking about, okay, that's a way into diversity, inclusion, ethics, values. You're going to actually hear about a lot of these topics today from our various speakers. Advocacy, again, Jonathan Lazar's talk this morning, universal usability. We can get at these things as design issues. And I guess ideally, you find ways to work all of that into your curriculum and programs. But so diversity is really part of everything that we do, whether or not we acknowledge that. And again, this is a collectively we. It's there and it should be dealt with. And part of it is the folks who work in these areas making that clearer, I think. Anybody who's walking out of an MLS program at this point, or MLIS, or whatever you name it, if they're not ready to work with diverse groups, if they're not aware of the diverse needs of you know, even if you're in a part of the country that's very monocultural in certain ways, there's still going to be people of different ages, different literacy levels, different digital literacy levels. You know, as this giant set of things, there's always at least some of these groups present. And without the tools to understand how do I help, how do I create programs, how do I advocate for, you wind up with service that really isn't equitable. So this idea of making us more inclusive, for lack of a more elegant way of putting it, it's partly innovative curricular design. It's building it into your curriculum everywhere, if you can. It's creating not the course that's never offered, but actually making it a standard part of what you teach. It's creating research. You know, those of you who are here who are academics who study this, you're well aware of how lonely it feels. It's really not a lot of us. And, you know, it's very funny because you look through the articles and like, oh, yeah, we're all citing each other. How much of this is really learning out there? So, you know, we can change curriculum. We can expand the universe of research going on about diversity so that we have better ideas about programs and services and know more what we can do to help people, what people need. There's a lot to look at. And the cultural heritage institutions, you know, the creation of programs, the idea that you're there to help your community, but you can also educate your community. The library, the museum, the archive can be a place where you're proactively changing, at least giving people the opportunities to change their attitudes, to learn more, to bring different groups in your community together who aren't interacting. So all of us have a stake in this and have the ability to make impacts. So the rest of the panel is going to be different perspectives on what you can do. And Katie Shilton from the University of Maryland is our next speaker.
Hi, so I'm Katie Shilton. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Maryland in the iSchool. And so when Paul laid out this idea of this panel, you know, we thought we would take a really Big Ten approach at thinking through what are ways that we can get this conversation going in different parts of our curriculum. Like, what are sort of levers to start these conversations and ways in? And so I was tasked with talking about values and ethics as one piece of this larger social justice mission in the iSchool. And I was tasked with this because I teach the information ethics class as well as information policy classes. And so what I've done with these courses is to try to focus on values and ethics as a way that everybody can talk about social justice issues, because everybody has a set of values that they bring both in their professional life and their personal life in various contexts that they've worked in and interacted with, and starting to question those values and ethics, or to question where they might push up against other people's values or different cultural values, can be a really fruitful way of sort of opening up these conversations. And specifically, I'm really interested in helping students think through how to bridge professional ethics, which might be slightly different from their personal ethics, but we also have professional organizations with codes of ethics, and to think about both how to think about how to bridge between their personal ethics and their professional ethics, and then how to put those into action in their work settings going forward. So a framework we almost always start with is, are there LIS values? Is that like a thing, right, in the world? Do we have library values? Sometimes I call this, is there like a library juice that we drink during library school, right? It's like a set of ethics and values that we all go away with. And the truth is, yes, to a large degree there is. And you know, you'll see this students coming out of like intellectual freedom, right? Nobody doesn't believe in that after library school. And that's library juice right there. So, but you know, where does that come from? Why do we value that, right? Why is that something we're all striving towards? So getting people to really think through that. So if you look at documents like the Library Bill of Rights, This is all a values document, right? So as part of our class discussions, we'll pick apart what are the values that we put into these documents and why are they there? So access or advocacy or openness. You know, when do we value openness? Well, openness can be in tension with privacy sometimes, right? So how do we weigh those various values? So this becomes a way of starting to talk about which of these do you personally value, which of these do you value as a profession. Another framework that I often like to work with students on, because in my own research I spend a lot of time in this space, is this idea called values in design. And the idea behind values in design is that, and this will surprise none of you, our technologies are not neutral, right? Values get embedded in technologies by designers and developers, and users appropriate, reappropriate, use technologies for their own values or according to their own values. So this image here is a famous example in the values and design world. It actually turns out to possibly be apocryphal, but it's very evocative, so I like to use it. This is one of the bridges designed by, oh my gosh, I've just forgotten his name, the public infrastructure designer in New York, who was very controversial, mid-century.
Moses?
Yes.
Moses?
Yes. Thank you. Very famously, Moses designed bridges to be a certain height in New York City, and those bridges were not high enough for buses to pass under. And so the buses couldn't make it to the public beaches. Well, who takes the bus in mid-century New York City? It was not rich people, right? And so this idea that you can build into the infrastructure access problems, right? And you see this with all kinds of digital technologies. We've talked about this today. This is this idea that our values get concretized within technologies. This is something I like to work with students on. Okay, so how do we do that? We have assignments. That's not enough of a surprise. A lot of times we do a policy and technology assignment where I ask students in my policy course to look at a familiar technology, Facebook, Twitter, something that they're using in a different class, and actually pick apart what values were designed into it and why. What does the technology enable you to do really well? What does it make it really hard to do? And why? Whose values are those? I also ask students in my policy class to do an op-ed assignment. Op-eds are values on the page, right? Where you're making a specific argument for or against a policy issue based on your values. We also talk about values tensions. So in my policy class that I'm teaching right now, I'm asking students for the final paper, they will see it as policy tensions, but really they're values tensions. I'm asking them to talk about two kinds of values that might be in conflict and how to resolve that. So openness versus privacy, or access versus intellectual property. So how do they resolve tensions in their workplace when they have two values in tension? We will also have discussions in class about applying traditional LIS values in workplace scenarios or to emerging technologies, as well as different ethical perspectives that might help with resolving some of these tensions. So traditional old school European ethical ones like utilitarian and deontological, but also virtue ethics and feminist ethics and non-Western perspectives. How do those help us resolve ethical challenges in our work? All right. We also do some activities because they're fun. and specifically, there have been some really good ones developed in the values and design world, and so I'm going to tell you about two really briefly. I really love Grow a Game. Grow a Game is a set of cards that you can order on the internet that are specifically, they help students design a game. Games are really easy to talk about in class because everybody has played a game at some point in their life. But they specifically ask you to take a familiar game and embed a value into it. So make Monopoly about sharing. Or make Scrabble about accessibility, right? And so all of a sudden, teams have to rethink, oh my gosh, well what does it mean to change the rules of a game so that we reflect these values? So I really love, that was a very successful, and it's fun because games are fun to talk about. A little bit more sort of on the serious side, but very useful, are the envisioning cards, also available online. And these are specifically beautifully illustrated cards that evoke questions about values that if you have a project, you can use to think through more deeply about your project. So they often ask things like, who are the stakeholders in this project? How long will this technology be available for? Are there various values tensions around that technology? It's basically a facilitated brainstorming activity. It's beautifully constructed and illustrated, very thoughtful. I highly recommend that as well. And then finally, to wrap it up, values in the classroom is awesome to talk about, a really important part of education, but taking it into action, I've been really interested in when and how do values discussions come up in people's professional work. It's one thing to lead people through it in class, another to have these conversations happen organically in class or in professional work. So a lot of my research has been about what I've been calling values levers, which are these practices that open conversations about values and ethics in the workplace. I've been studying technology developers, so a little bit of a different population. But I think that these happen in libraries as well. And I'd be really interested to start thinking through when are those moments in your professional work when ethics have come up and values have come up? Is it during collection development? Is it during hiring? Book challenges, strategic planning? What are those moments? And finding those and sort of having students think about those moments. Some challenges that I want to close with. Huge question. When we're talking about values in design, especially in a diversity context, whose values are we talking about? I mentioned professional values before because there's some sort of official guidance one can have on what values we're supposed to have, but those values are pretty traditional, pretty Western. Are those the right value sets to be looking at, right? Whose values are we talking about here? So I think that is a question that I don't necessarily want to resolve so much as challenge students to think about. And I know Nicole's going to talk a little bit, I think, about online classes and distance learning. And one of the challenges that I've faced teaching my information ethics class online is that it can be really hard to guide online conversations on sensitive topics. So classrooms are a wonderful place to have these conversations. People will take little risks, and you can encourage those risks, but also sometimes as a professor, you need to push back, right? When people are saying things that you're not, well, let's challenge that a little. Let's unpack that statement. And you can do that, for instance, statements of bias, right? That need to be challenged in a classroom. Online, you can ask people to unpack it, and they can ignore you, which is really challenging. And often the discussion will kind of go off in a different direction without it getting explicitly addressed, right? So this is something I've been struggling with. I would love to hear if other people have successfully facilitated some of these sensitive conversations online. And next, I'm really pleased to introduce Nicole.
So good afternoon. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm doing at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Just by way of introduction, I wanted to mention two things. To Denise's keynote a little earlier, I just wanted to alert you all to one of the wonderful things that ALA has done. I am a ALA Spectrum Doctoral Fellow, which means that I completed my doctoral work thanks to a fellowship. And so I was at another conference last week and someone said to me, I didn't know you all existed. Like, we saw the announcement, but we didn't know anyone actually finished. We finished. So there are 4 of us that are actually teaching in LIS schools around the country. One person has completed and is in practice at Academic Library, and there are a couple more people in the pipe ready to finish and go into the LIS professoriate. And the other reason that I mention that is because I cite one of Paul's articles regularly, something that he wrote with Renee Franklin Hill about the virtuous cycle, or excuse me, I always do that, it's the virtuous circle, excuse me. And so the idea is a lot of what we've been talking about all day today. So in order to serve the communities as best we can, we need to have staff and professionals that look like the communities we're serving. And that same idea goes to library school. So believe it or not, I get a lot of strange looks when the kids come into the classroom in Illinois because they've never seen anyone that looks like me in the front of the classroom. Whereas there are some that are like, oh my God, where did you come from? Right? And then others are like, we're not sure what to do with her. So to that idea that, if students are not necessarily as receptive to me stands to reason. They might not be as receptive to some of the communities that they're serving. And so, you know, I mentioned earlier in one of the comments that a part of my research is to talk about diversity in LIS at the doctoral level, at the faculty level, to facilitate this circle. So we need to, you know, better represent in the library graduate programs, so then we can therefore put out better professionals, more aware professionals, some of which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, so we can better serve some of those communities. So I am that person at Illinois who had to create the class. I'm not sure how it happened, but there wasn't a class for diverse populations or users before I arrived at Illinois 2 years ago. And just, you know, just in a nutshell, there have been some climate issues. A lot of students, like my friend from the University of Denver, who had to ask for some changes. And to give credit to my administration, there was some hiring decisions made, and then once I got there, I said to my associate dean, you know, there's no class on diversity. Can I create it? She's like, do whatever you want to do. So a semester later, countless hours of trying to figure out what exactly to teach, I was allowed to create that class. I was also allowed to resurrect a class, Social Justice in the Information Professions. And so one of the things that I've been working on this semester is to try and have more conversations with my faculty. To Sam's point earlier this morning, change is slow, they don't like it. And then, you know, you get the young untenured one from the East Coast that they think is aggressive and all these things, and she keeps talking about diversity. So it's one of those things, you know, that you keep just trying to have those conversations. I can't wait to go back to Illinois and talk about what Fiona mentioned earlier about trying to have all these resources ready to put into the curriculum. It's among the conversations that we've had all semester, all year actually. So to get into specifically what I wanted to talk to you about today is the social justice class for information professions. Now, to Katie's point, I teach social justice and my information services to diverse users classes online. Now, there's a two-pronged reason for that. We have a very large distance learning program in Illinois, and it's really just an access issue. If I don't teach it online, I'm missing half of my kids. To the other point, I have actually found it easier to teach these classes online than in person. We do a lot of heavy talk. We do a lot of things, we talk about a lot of topics that some of the students have never heard of and are uncomfortable with. So we talk about privilege, we talk about racism, we talk about all the isms. And so to the screen that's up now, I do a lot of setup work during the first class, and I tell them you have to be comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable. You have to be able to take a risk, and you have to speak up. And so, you know, to Katie's point, my class is synchronous. So if they choose not to follow along with what I'm saying, I go right back to it. Asynchronous is a whole different animal. And so I actually tell them at the end of the first class, you know, this may not be the class for you. My class isn't elective. And that's okay. You know, maybe it's not the right class for you now. Maybe it's never going to be the right class for you. And some of them, that is the case. But I want that learning environment to be such that those who really choose to be there and really want to dig in are going to be able to have that safe space to have that conversation. So just what's up on the screen, this is part of my setup work. So I talk to them a lot about different perspectives. We could all have the same idea and describe it in 6 different ways. And to that end, when we're having these discussions, particularly in the online context, it is a respectful environment. You don't have to agree, but you do have to be nice about it. Then we start talking about various definitions of social justice. You know, some of the students have come into the class completely open-minded, and I love it, but they may not have a complete grasp on what social justice is, what diverse populations are. I had one student tell me, oh, I took this class because the advisor told me it was marketable and I should take it. So she and I had to have a conversation. But at the end of the class, she was one of the best students I had. So fortunately, she was open, if however misguided in the beginning. So this picture, and this is actually one of the things that spurred the most discussion with my students, because it gave them a new way to look at things, because we're always talking about equality of access. But just because everyone is let in the door doesn't mean they're on a level playing field. So how do we facilitate that two-part process? Because it's not just letting them in, it's, we talked about earlier, information literacy. How do they access the information? Then we have to teach them how to use the information effectively. It's not just, we're here, come in, and then we're done. So a couple more definitions that we talk about, and we talk a lot about destroying the systematic marginalization and privilege. We talk about privilege a lot. And I have to say that the students, and it could be because it's an elective and it's a little bit of preaching to the choir, I've had a lot of students be confused by it, and really have that moment where it just hits them and they're like, oh my God. But fortunately, no one has been openly hostile. And I've been in other classrooms where I wasn't the instructor, where the discussion of privilege got nasty and hostile real quick. So some of what we talk about is creating awareness and bringing social justice to the profession and also to the LIS curriculum. And so Pateman and Vincent in 2010, they talk about the various things that librarians need to do to incorporate social justice. And so, embracing equality and diversity, and this is all a lot of what we talked about today, focusing on needs-based service, really knowing the communities you serve. In the diverse populations class I teach, their major assignment is to conduct a community analysis. We talk a lot about one size does not fit all, and how do you customize your services and your resources. And just because you do a community analysis today doesn't mean that in 5 years you're not going to have to do it again, because all of this is a very dynamic process. Communities are dynamic in that way. We talk about collaborating with the community. We talk a lot about empathy and how empathy is going to open those channels and those doors to be able to facilitate that service that we aspire to. So just a couple other things, some of the themes in social justice teaching, at least in the course that I'm teaching. We go for all the ideal stuff, like making the world a better place. And we want to, make the world a better place, but how do we actually do that on a day-to-day basis? Because some of this work can be messy. And some of this work, you have to roll your sleeves up. I remember one of the students asked me, how do you do this work all the time? Because that's part of my research, it's part of my teaching. And that whole idea of diversity fatigue that was mentioned earlier, it's real. And sometimes you have to take a break. Sometimes you have to go screen, you do whatever you need to do, and then you come back. So we want to give them the things to aspire to, and then we want to be able to give them the tools to be able to enact some of these ideals that are on the screen. So this is a short and incomplete list of the issues that we talked about in the social justice class. We talked about a lot of the isms. Also to Denise's point earlier, I'm in the Midwest. Diversity seems to be new and exciting in the Midwest. We have a lot of students from Chicago, and so they're aware, right? But I also have a lot of students that are coming from rural areas in various parts of Illinois, Iowa, the Midwest, and they get to Urbana-Champaign, which is not a hotbed of diversity, but it still is more than what they've seen. And so they come in and they can be a little shell-shocked, and then they see me, and then they get all upset. So it's true. But to say that, some of these topics may be brand new for them. And so I refer them, there's a series of books that's in 3 different editions now. It's Readings in Social Justice. It's the first author is Adams, and I can't remember the second author right now. But I based the class, or reworked the class on this book, so they would have something in the literature to go to be able to explain these different issues to them. And so once they did that, I actually had it broken out almost perfectly the way that the students decided which issues that they wanted to do further research on. And so we covered ableism, adultism, ageism, and the rest on the screen. The ones on religious oppression were really interesting. And those were particularly enlightening because, people don't necessarily talk about their religion, or they think that everyone else is like them, right? So, socioeconomic status, and then unexamined privilege. So the students worked with these topics all semester. One of their assignments was to essentially do a TED Talk. So they had to find one of these topics that spoke to them in some way, and then they had to come in. The distance students have to come to campus once a semester, and we spend 8 hours, and we just workshop, and we do work. And so they had to pick a topic that spoke to them and what they thought that they might want to do in their professional careers, and they had to tell us about it. And so their other assignment was to continue on with that topic and essentially write a position paper. If they had to persuade their board or maybe their director about why one of these issues should be better addressed in their organization, how would they go about that? So they pick a topic and they work with it through the entire semester. And they really did some good work there. So I say that these are the librarians that I want to produce. I want them on the ground. I want them out from behind the desk. I want them carrying signs. I want them raising hell, whatever it is we need them to do. This particular picture is from the Occupy Wall Street movement in New York City a couple years ago. And so, fight those stereotypes. We do a lot of social justice, civil rights. We do a lot of this work that makes a difference. And so, embrace it, get out there and do it. And so I feel like in order to produce these librarians, these are the type of topics and the type of work that we need to do in the curriculum. Now, to that end, we've been talking about integrating it and not just having the class and the elective. Now, I teach information literacy, I teach information behavior, and I incorporate all of that, into my classes. For some of my colleagues, that is a little harder. A colleague was teaching, and I'm not gonna get the title right, but essentially it's global issues and multiculturalism in children's literature. But she also teaches the regular children's literature course. And she got really bad reviews at the end of the semester for the regular children's literature course because of her integrating diverse books and diverse topics. The students said, we don't want to talk about that, we just want to talk about the real children's books. We have work to do. Okay, so, this idea of integrating is easier said than done, but we push forward with that. So I just want to end by talking a little bit more about one of the things that we did for the Students on Campus Day. I have formed actually a really nice partnership with the Office of Inclusion and Intercultural Relations on my campus. And so one of their people came over and he did a 3-hour workshop exclusively on privilege. And so just to back up a little bit, we had mentioned privilege, we had talked about privilege, so it wasn't like the speaker just came in and hit them over the head with it. So they were prepped, and they were apprehensive, but they were ready. And so one of the things that he did was he got up on the whiteboard and he wrote down race, class, religion, ability, gender, sexuality, and some other things. And it was almost like a baseball score sheet. And he said to all of them, decide which categories that you fit in, and then give yourself a number from 1 to 8. And so my students, there were no people of color in my student body. I was the only person of color in the room, including the guest speaker. And so all of them had either 6, 7, or 8. And so they were feeling pretty good. And so then when I come in with a 4 or 5, it kind of, like, how does that work? And so, once the guest speaker broke it all down and really kind of forced them to look in this mirror of privilege, and because it's this idea that they're not even really cognizant of how they're walking in the world. And so when you have myself or someone else say, well, that's not really how it works for me, then it starts to open up some of those doors and those channels in regards to empathy. So when the guest speaker finished, you could hear a pin drop in that room. And this is a very boisterous class, full of opinions. They think they can teach the class themselves. And the guest speaker said, well, how do you feel? And unanimously they said, we're uncomfortable. And we're just, disappointed in all of these different things. And so then I asked them, I said, but do you want to leave? And they were like, no, we have to finish. And, we're uncomfortable, but we feel good about it. And it goes back to that prep work that you have to do in the front end of the course to say it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to say something that you think is perhaps not popular. It's okay to disagree with someone. But they were so open, they were willing to put themselves out there and be uncomfortable so they could learn something about themselves. So I have at least put out 13 students that are willing to carry these signs. So we're going to keep offering the course, keep offering diverse users, and hopefully put out a few more of these students so they can join you on the ground and really work towards better serving the communities and give them that service that they deserve.